All soufflés consist of two basic components: whipped egg whites along with a thick egg yolk based base. Combine those two components and bake, and you're left with a light, airy, and delicious final product that looks like it took a lot more effort than it actually did. So let's talk about how to make it. And the soufflé is a dish that has a reputation for being kind of tricky to make, but in reality, it's actually very simple once you break it down. So let's talk about the soufflé formula. Now, as I mentioned, there are really just two components to a soufflé, each of which utilizes a different part of the egg. You have your whipped egg white mixture, which is what provides the airiness and rise to your soufflé, and you have your egg yolk mixture, which provides the majority of the flavor. And the general process to make it is very simple. So you'll start by separating your eggs, then whipping the egg whites to stiff peaks. So as you beat the egg whites, you'll be creating air bubbles throughout the mixture and increasing the overall volume by up to about 8 times its original size. And at the same time, you'll be unfolding the egg white proteins, which then bond to each other to form a strong network of reinforcement around those air bubbles to ensure that they don't pop. So that's why whipping egg whites is such a powerful technique, because you can add such a large volume of air to them while maintaining a very stable structure. So they can then be easily incorporated into a variety of baked goods to add some extra airiness. Now, it's also recommended to add a small amount of cream of tartar to your egg whites before whipping them, just about 1/4 teaspoon per 3 egg whites. The cream of tartar is acidic, so it actually alters the electric charge on the proteins of the egg whites, which helps them to form an even more stable foam. And I know that just sounds like some made up science nonsense, but it's true and it actually does work. Now, aside from the cream of tartar, the only modification you might make to the egg whites is to add some sugar if you're making a sweet soufflé. So about 2 tablespoons of sugar per 3 egg whites generally works well. And in addition to adding sweetness, the sugar helps to further stabilize the egg white proteins, which creates an even more resilient structure. But if the sugar is added too early in the process, it actually can hinder the foaming ability of the egg whites, so you want to wait to add the sugar until your egg whites are whipped to soft peaks. So here I'm making a chocolate soufflé, and we can see that once my egg whites are about at this point where the peaks flop over just slightly, I'll add my sugar. Then from there, I'll just finish whipping them to stiff peaks, or in other words, when the peaks stand up completely straight. So once the foam is developed, the sugar actually improves its stability by making it thicker and more cohesive, and by strengthening the bubbles throughout the foam. So now let's just set that aside for the time being as we talk about our egg yolk mixture, otherwise known as the soufflé base. And again, this is what's going to determine the flavor of our soufflé, so it's the part that you'll modify depending on what type of soufflé you actually want to make. So my favorite is a chocolate soufflé where the base consists of a simple mixture of melted chocolate, butter, and egg yolks, but a cheese soufflé is another classic, so I'll be showing you how to make that one in this video as well. And all of the recipes that I talk about can be found on my website, which will be linked below. But you can really make a soufflé out of almost anything. So for example, you can make a vanilla custard base, you can make a pureed fruit base, and you can really use any sort of thickened starchy sauce as a base as well. For example, a bechamel sauce. The main thing to consider is that the thicker the base, the less your soufflé will rise, but the more resistant it'll be to falling. Because if you've ever made a soufflé, you know that although they do rise beautifully in the oven, they also fall very quickly as they cool, usually within just a few minutes of removing from the oven. So using a thicker base can help to prevent a bit of that post-oven fall. But in the case of my chocolate soufflé, I've just combined 4 ounces or 114 grams of semi-sweet chocolate with 1/4 cup or 56 grams of unsalted butter over a double boiler and allowed those to melt until completely smooth. So if you want a less sweet soufflé, you could use bittersweet chocolate, or if you want a more sweet soufflé, you could use something like a sweeter milk chocolate. Then I let that mixture cool for about 3 to 5 minutes before whisking in my 3 egg yolks, and that's all there is to it. So it's important to note that if you do make a base that requires heating as this one did, you'll usually want to let it cool a bit and then add the egg yolks at the very end to make sure they don't curdle. But now once we've got our base, it's just time to combine that with our whipped egg whites and then bake. So traditionally, it's recommended to fold the base into the egg whites, but as America's Test Kitchen has pointed out, if you've whipped the egg whites to stiff peaks, they'll actually be plenty resilient to withstand some more vigorous mixing. So what I do is just pour the base right into my stand mixer with the egg whites and mix on a low to medium speed for about 5 to 10 seconds until completely combined. So you may need to stir just a bit by hand afterwards to incorporate the parts that the stand mixer couldn't reach, but it's a lot easier than folding everything by hand, which really just isn't necessary to do. So that's our completed soufflé mix, and now it's time to get ready to bake. So start by preheating your oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 190 degrees Celsius, with the baking tray inside that you've set to the second highest rack of your oven. I found that 375 degrees is pretty much the sweet spot for all soufflés that I make, but anything between about 325 and 425 degrees will work fine, so you can feel free to play around with it. Basically, the hotter the temperature, the quicker your soufflé will rise and fall, and the quicker the top will cook relative to the inside. So for example, if you're making a cheese soufflé and you want a nicely charred top with a slightly runnier interior, you may want to bake it at about 400 or 425 degrees. Now as our oven heats, we'll also prepare our soufflé dishes, and for these you'll want to use a ramekin or any other oven-safe bowl. In this case, I'm using 1 cup ramekins, and my chocolate soufflé recipe here, which I've made using 3 eggs, is going to fill 2 of these. So to prevent the soufflés from sticking, we'll want to coat each dish with some softened butter. And it's also traditional to coat each dish with some granulated sugar when making a sweet soufflé, or some grated Parmesan cheese or breadcrumbs when making a savory soufflé. So those will help to create a nice flavorful crust on the outside of the soufflé as it bakes. Then it's time to fill up the dishes, so in the case of a chocolate soufflé, you'll want to fill it up all the way to the top to really achieve that signature soufflé rise. And I also like to flatten off the top with a plastic bench scraper to give the finished soufflés a more polished look, but as we'll talk about shortly, you don't always want to fill your soufflé dishes up to the top. It really just depends on the type of soufflé base that you're using. Now another nice thing about soufflés is that you don't actually have to bake them right away. So once you get to this point, you can actually save them in the fridge, covered up for up to about 24 hours. But in this case, I am going to bake mine right away. So once the oven is fully preheated, I'll just place the soufflés right onto my hot baking tray and throw them into the oven for about 14 to 18 minutes, or until they've risen nicely and are set everywhere except in the very center. So as the soufflé bakes, all of the little bubbles throughout will inflate as the gases heat and expand, and more gas will be produced as the water within the soufflé evaporates, so both of those factors will lead to that signature soufflé rise. Now the degree to which you cook them is really just personal preference, so with a chocolate soufflé, I like a little gooiness in the center, but if you like them more well done, you could bake until it's set everywhere. And you can also use a toothpick to test doneness, so I would just look for a little bit of batter still stuck to the toothpick. But anyways, as we talked about earlier, your soufflés will fall pretty quickly after being removed from the oven, as the gases cool and become more compressed, so you'll want to serve them as soon as possible. But another nice thing about soufflés is that they will rise again when reheated. So if you know you're going to have to reheat your soufflé before serving, I'd recommend baking it just short of done so that it doesn't overcook when you bake it again. Then to reheat, you'll just need to bake it for about half the usual time until it rises and is cooked to your liking. So now that we've made a sweet soufflé, let's take a look at a savory one, starting with probably the most classic, which is the cheese soufflé. So again, we'll just start with our whipped egg whites, and I do like to use a stand mixer whenever I make soufflés, but you could also just use an electric hand mixer, or even whisk by hand if you don't mind using a little bit of elbow grease. And when it comes to separating my eggs, I found that the easiest way is just to crack the eggs straight into the bowl of my stand mixer and then fish out the yolks with my hands. But if you do it this way, you just have to be extra careful not to break any of the yolks. And this time, of course, we won't be adding sugar unless you want to end up with some weird cheesy dessert hybrid. So we just have our 3 egg whites along with a 1/4 teaspoon of cream of tartar. Now the cheese souffle base is a bit more labor intensive than the chocolate souffle. So to make it, we'll actually start off with a bechamel sauce, which is basically just a milk-based sauce that's thickened with a white roux. And then we'll melt some cheese into it and then let it cool for a few minutes before finally adding the egg yolks. And again, all of these recipes will be available on my website, which is linked below. So we'll start by melting 2 tablespoons of butter in a pan, then adding to that 2 tablespoons of flour, and cooking for just about a minute before the flour has really started to take on any color. Then we'll add 2/3 cup of whole milk while whisking to ensure that the flour doesn't clump up and that the milk doesn't burn. And we'll just cook that down for about a minute to let it thicken, but in the meantime we'll season and flavor our sauce. So for that we'll use about 1/8 teaspoon of paprika, a pinch of cayenne pepper, some black pepper and salt to taste, and about 1/8 teaspoon of freshly grated nutmeg, or less if you're using pre-ground nutmeg. And that leaves us with a completed bechamel sauce, so if you've never made one before, now you have. But for this recipe, we're not done yet, so we're also going to add 3.5 ounces of grated cheese. So in this case, I'm using 3 ounces of sharp cheddar plus a 1/2 ounce of Parmesan. Gruyere would also be good in place of the cheddar, and that's actually the more traditional choice in a cheese souffle, but I personally just prefer the taste of cheddar here. And as always, it's best to grate your own cheese because you want something that's going to melt pretty well. And when you buy pre-grated cheeses at the grocery store, they're usually coated in some sort of anti-caking agent, which messes with their meltability. So now you should be left with a smooth, thick sauce, which you can remove from the heat and allow to cool for about 5 to 10 minutes before whisking in your 3 egg yolks, at which point your souffle base will be complete. So again, we'll then add that base to the egg white mixture and stir to combine, then fill our ramekins, which I've coated this time with some grated Parmesan in addition to the usual softened butter. And with the cheese souffle, you don't want to fill the ramekin up all the way, so I would leave about an inch of space at the top. Because the cheese sauce is pretty gooey and oozy, so it will overflow if you're not careful. But either way, you'll bake at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, just like we did before, but this time for about 18 to 22 minutes until the souffle is slightly charred at the top and set everywhere, including in the center. But again, you can cook it more or less depending on your preferences. Now I'm sure you're getting the idea by now, so we're just going to make one more, which will be slightly different than the others because we're going to cook it on the stove top rather than in the oven. And that's because it'll be a souffle omelet. So you could still bake this one in the oven, which I guess would make it an omelet souffle, but I'm going to cook it in a pan, so I'm calling it a souffle omelet. Now up until we cook it, the process is exactly the same. So we'll whip our egg whites along with some cream of tartar until they reach stiff peaks. Then we'll make our base, which this time will consist of 3 egg yolks combined with 2 tablespoons of melted butter, some salt and pepper to taste, and about a ½ ounce of sharp cheddar cheese. Then we'll mix that in with our whipped egg whites and we've got our souffle mix. And to cook it, it'll be the same as a traditional omelet, so we'll heat up a pan over medium heat, then melt a bit of butter inside and just pour the souffle mix in. Now you can top it with whatever you like, so here I'm using about another 1½ ounces of sharp cheddar cheese, along with some green bell peppers, some onion, and some bacon. And of course, if you're adding meat, you'll want to make sure it's already cooked because it's not going to be in the pan for very long here. Then I'll actually cover it up at this point to make sure that the top of the omelet sets completely, and after about 3 to 4 minutes, it's all done. So it's actually really simple to make, and it leads to a very light and fluffy omelet, which is a nice change of pace from the usual dense, sort of heavy omelet that most people typically make.